Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William McKinley, and the focus is Cuba, China, and Canal. The year is 1898. The Spanish-American War is over. The peace treaty has been signed. We talked in the last episode about the disposition of the Philippines, but what about Cuba, that island off the coast of Florida, which started it all with the drive for Cuban independence? Recall at the beginning of the war, the United States Congress had passed the Kettler Amendment, which said the United States hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination when that is accomplished to leave the government and control of the island to its people. This was U.S. law. William McKinley agreed with this. This was not about imperialism. There was no jingoism that's going to occur, to use McKinley's words, sort of a word of art at the time. But now he's got Cuba. What's he going to do with it? First thing to do was to put somebody in charge, and for that he picked Major General John Brooke to become the military governor who oversaw the formal transfer of power January 1st of 1899. Just like that, after 4 centuries, Spain was out of Cuba, Spain was out of the Caribbean. Some in the United States actually wanted to push McKinley to annex Cuba. This had been a long desire for many Americans for decades, but McKinley said no, that was not the aim of this war. He favored independence for the Cuban people, but he agreed ultimately that the conditions were not yet right for self-rule. For the time being, he wanted to foster this policy of benevolent assimilation, to assert control over the Cuban government and the Cuban people, but do it in a friendly way. That was his guidance to General Brooke. He told Brooke, so far as you can accomplish it, let your government be a government of law, not one of military force. Be stern and summary where those qualities are necessary, but let moderation, kindness, leniency, and adherence to the forms and rules that pertain to civil government be the characteristics of our rule while we continue to govern this people. Well, like in the Philippines, a lot of people in the Cuban population weren't happy with this. They wanted independence. That was what they were fighting the Spanish for. They didn't want to just flip from the Spanish oppressors to the American oppressors. Different, though, from the Philippines. In the Philippines, there was an armed insurrection that resulted from this that lasted a couple of years. The Cubans did not rise up in arms against the Americans. And the fact that there were 45,000 American soldiers present was probably one of the reasons why, but there were still many Cubans who weren't happy. The Cubans convened a constitutional convention, and this was influenced by another law passed by the U.S. government called the Platt Amendment, introduced by Orville Platt of Connecticut, but basically written by Secretary of State Elihu Root on behalf of President McKinley. There were 7 conditions that were effectively placed on the Cuban government in the form of the Platt Amendment. A couple of the key ones: restricted engagement in international commerce by the Cubans without the U.S. involvement, if necessary, in some of those decisions. Another decision was to sell or lease land for a coaling or naval station on the Cuban property to the Americans. This is how the United States got Guantanamo Bay. A third critical element said that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. Well, this was incredibly broad, this ability to intervene, really for almost any reason the United States felt necessary. Well, the Platt Amendment passed Congress March 2nd, 1901. Just a couple of days before McKinley was sworn into office for his second term. He signed it into law, and a lot of the Cubans balked. This was not what they got into this fight with the Americans for in the first place, and certainly very different from the Kettler Amendment at the beginning of the war. But again, they really had no choice. And in fact, the Platt Amendment found its way word for word into the Cuban Constitution. There was no relief, no changes. It was now the law of the land in Cuba. Difficult to reconcile these two amendments. Kettler before the war, Platt after the war. Kettler was pretty much saying the United States wanted to go in, help the Cubans get independence, and get out. The Platt Amendment was very different. This right to intervene, open-ended. The U.S. role could be considered going on and on for quite some time. What was the right answer, and what did William McKinley think? Again, he favored independence, and he did not see this as imperialism. This was temporary. Control was necessary because the Cuban people were not yet ready for self-rule. Benevolent assimilation was the way to go. For many Cubans, this was imperialism. And while they were pacified initially, after a couple of years of this, there would be some uprising, a lot of headaches for William McKinley's successors. That military occupation would still last on and off for several years, not as long as in the Philippines, but certainly a lot longer than many of the people in Cuba wanted. They had their freedom, but still this relationship with the United States, the ability to intervene, not exactly what they wanted, and lasted a lot longer than they expected. All right, let's flip back to Asia. About 1,000 miles northeast of the Philippines sat China, the most populous nation in the world, 450 million people. It had been about 50 years since the Americans had had their first trade deal with the Chinese, but the Americans had actually fallen behind many of the other countries. And this was a concern for President McKinley, Secretary of State Hay. And Hay had befriended Charles Beresford, who had established in his mind a policy called the open door policy in China. Well, what did this mean? And again, this was an idea where tariffs would apply equally to all the powers would recognize each other's vested interests, there would be no power that would discriminate against the others in terms of harbor duties, basically trying to open up access to China for any foreign power, and frankly give the United States a bit of a boost. Well, Hay liked this idea, so he sent a letter to his counterparts in Europe wanting to see if they would be open to formally adopting this open door policy. Well, he got responses back from just about everybody, and most were non-committal. There were no real objections in these letters coming back, but there wasn't agreement either. But Hay decided, well, no objections, that's concurrence as far as he was concerned. And so he just announced publicly on March 20th, 1900, that the open door policy was in effect. And when nobody complained about it, it basically became a fait accompli, and this was a significant accomplishment for the Secretary of State and the United States. But the real problem in China wasn't about getting trade and going in on the ports. The real problem going on in China at this time was in the middle of the country. There was a backlash going on in China against foreign influence which had been growing. And the group called the Boxers started to rise up, and it got violent. The violence initially was perpetrated against Christian missionaries out in the countryside. It was brutal. Mass murders going on, and it spread. It spread geographically and in scope. Not just Christian missionaries. Basically, any foreigner was going to be subject to attack. Again, mass murders. It was called the Boxer Rebellion, and the government in Peking, the capital of China, was doing nothing to stop this. Well, again, it expanded the Boxer Rebellion in geographic reach, ultimately getting to the capital. And again, no involvement of the Chinese government to suppress. And now foreign diplomats in the capital were at risk. The American minister, Edwin Conger, sounded the alarm. June 4th, 1900, the rebels had reached the capital. June 5th, the situation was getting worse. The threat was real. On June 11th, he cabled that we are besieged in Peking, entirely cut off from outside communications. Now, the American contingency in China in the capital, 32 civilians, 25 of whom were women and children, plus 35 Marines with very limited arms to try to defend them. In fact, the Americans' legation found common cause with the other legations. They decided to pool their resources. They were all centrally located. They pooled their resources. They built barricades, and frankly, were hoping for help. June 19th, the Boxers continued the attack. In fact, they launched artillery into the compounds of the foreign diplomats, rifle fire. At this point, the German ambassador to Baron von Kettler said, look, this has to stop. He left the safety of this compound. He was immediately gunned down, killed. Nations began to rush soldiers in to try to help. President McKinley ordered 2,000 soldiers from the Philippines, and interestingly, he did it in a hurry. He felt it was necessary. He did it without congressional approval. And this goes back, the only other time something like that had happened was almost 100 years before, when Thomas Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy to go against the Barbary pirates without congressional approval. It's really the only other time in American history to date that something like this had happened without Congress involved. But again, the president felt he had no choice. He had to get troops there in a hurry. Well, troops were arriving from countries all over the world, and there was chaos in the ports of China because no one was in charge. Eventually, they sat down, they formed what was called the Eight-Nation Alliance. 17,000 soldiers, and they began a month-long charge to go from the ports to get to Peking, and it was brutal. They were out to punish the Chinese, not just to defeat those in their way, but to punish them for what was going on against the locals. And it was July the 14th, after about a month, they finally got to the walls of Peking. They broke through, the Boxers were routed, the legations were liberated with about 3 days of supplies left. Well, the royal family of China had actually fled. There were negotiations then did get underway, and William McKinley, the President of the United States, actually felt the foreign powers were being too aggressive. This wasn't necessary. Let's get this thing over with, was his opinion. They wanted to execute too many people, an indemnity that was too high, and McKinley paired himself with a couple of the other countries and actually led to get this thing to a conclusion with less severe punishment for the Chinese, although a $334 million in US dollar indemnity was charged to the Chinese to be paid out over 39 years. A military presence would stay for a while to enforce some of these new rules. It did assert, as William McKinley's assertion in the negotiations, an increasingly sign of importance of the United States in global affairs, but for now at least, the Boxer Rebellion was over. The United States had recently acquired, just in the last year, the Philippines, Hawaii through annexation, Guam in the war. This increased the need in the eyes of many for that Central American canal, something that the Americans had wanted, in fact, Europeans had wanted for decades, to increase the transportation routes both for the United States, for trade purposes, as well as military purposes, to be able to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back and forth much faster than was able to do today. There was a problem, though. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had been negotiated between the United States and Great Britain about 50 years before under Zachary Taylor, and it basically said that neither side could build a canal without the other being involved. Well, the United States wanted to go it alone at this point. They didn't want to deal with the British, and their goal was to abrogate this treaty. This was a priority for William McKinley, who said the construction of such a maritime highway is now more than ever indispensable to that intimate and ready intercommunication between our eastern and western seaboards. John Hay, the Secretary of State, was put in charge of this. Now, he had good relationships with the British because he had served there recently as ambassador. And he tried his best to get what he could in a deal that was called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which passed in early 1900. It repealed the bulk of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, and it conceded most of the points that the Americans wanted. The treaty was signed, it was sent to the United States Senate, and the senators balked. They balked primarily at one provision. That provision was that the canal was, per this treaty, would be open to all countries at all times. No exceptions, even in a state of war. And the American senators who had to vote on this treaty said, no way. The United States, if we're going to build this thing, we're going to have to be able to shut it down at time of war. We need that provision in there. They raked Hay over the coals, really public embarrassment in terms of his willingness to give on this point. Hay even said, look, President McKinley, I'm going to resign. If I'm the problem, get me out of here. And McKinley said, no, you've done a good job. We just need to finish the job, so let's get back at it. Well, this time Hay actually worked with the senators, tried to make sure he knew exactly what they wanted before he got back together with the British, did that, and they eventually negotiated the second version of the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. And sure enough, the British did agree to abrogate all of Clayton-Bulwer. It was gone, and the Americans did have the right to fortify and, in the case of war, actually shut down the canal. The British agreed to this. And finally, the Senate got the treaty. It was approved, and eventually the Panama Canal could get started to be built. By this point, though, President William McKinley was no longer president. In fact, he was no longer alive. But that's the story for another day. That is William McKinley and Cuba, China, and Canal from the life of William McKinley. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.